Hilchos Matnos Aniyim Perek Shishi, the laws of gifts to the poor, chapter 6. In chapter 6 of these laws, by divine providence, we're going to be learning about the sixth gift that belongs to the poor people. As the Rambam begins in Halacha Aleph, Matana Acheres Shishis, Yesh LaAniyim Bezerah Haaretz. There is a sixth gift which the poor people have the right to when it comes to the produce of the land. What were the first five? The first five are the ones we discussed in the last 5 chapters. Peah, leaving a corner or a part of the field or a tree when you harvest it. Leket. Leket is the idea that when you harvest and stalks fall out of your hand while gathering the bundles or while harvesting, those fallen stalks go to the poor. The equivalent to that when it comes to grapes is peret. Same idea, but it's called a third gift, fallen grapes when you harvest a vineyard. Talking about grapes, we went to the fourth gift, oilulois, immature, underdeveloped grapes. And the fifth gift was the one we discussed yesterday, shikha, forgotten stalks. Now we come to the sixth one. And the sixth one is, V'hu ha-maiser shenoisnin la'aniyim. It's a tenth of the produce that has to be given to the poor people. V'hu ha-nikra maiser ani. It's also called the tithe of the poor. Now, the tithe of the poor does not mean that we give 10% of all the produce that's grown to the poor people. As we're about to see, there's a whole order of tithes that have to be separated from produce, which we've actually touched upon many, many times throughout the last 7 books of the Rambam. This is our famous gifts from produce chart, where what's going to emerge is that by the time you get to Maiser Ani, by the time you get to the tithe that belongs to the poor, there's a whole bunch of other tithes that have to be given first. Those are each going to have a full section of laws coming up in this book. There's going to be a full section of laws about Truma, the 2% you give to the Kohen, a full section of laws about Maiser, 10% you give to the Levi, a full section of laws about Maiser Sheni, the second tithe that the farmer takes to Jerusalem and has to eat it in a holy state. And now, kind of in a way jumping ahead of ourselves, we're going to get the laws that relate to the final tithe, the tithe that belongs to the poor. It's here because it's part of the section of laws, Matnos Aniyim, gifts to the poor, but understand that it's part of a larger scope of tithes that are separated every time we give produce. And because the Rambam is jumping ahead of himself, so he has to actually give you the order of these tithes in short. Again, we're going to expand upon each one in a separate set of laws, but in short, we're going to get the general gist of how gifts from produce are separated so we can appreciate what exactly this Maiser Ani gift consists of. So the Rambam says, Halacha Beis, V'zeu seder trumos u'maisers. The following represents the order of separations and tithes that have to be taken from produce. Achar shekoitzer zera ha'aretz, oisef pri ha'etz. After a person harvests the produce of the land or gathers the fruit of his trees, v'tigamri malachtai, and all the work associated with the harvesting is completed, mafrish mimenu echad min hachamishim. He is supposed to separate 1/50. Simple English, 2%. V'zeu anikra truma gedola. This is called sometimes plain truma. Here the Rambam refers to it by its full name, truma gedola, the great truma, the great separation. V'noisna lakayin, and this 1/50, this 2%, has to be given to the Kohen. About this tithe, it is said in the Torah, Reishis de gancha tireishcha v'yitzarecha. This is a verse in Parshas Shoftim. It says, the beginning of your grain, the beginning of your wine, the beginning of your oil, titan loy, the verse concludes, you have to give to the Kohen. That's the gift being referred to here. Beginning is the reference to the 2% that you give to the Kohen. Then, ba'achar kach, afterwards, mafrish min hashar echad me'asara. You take from what remains 1/10. So while it will be easy to say that 1/10 is 10%, but considering the fact that you've already taken 2%, so there's really only 98% left, so a tenth would really be 9.8. Let's just for simplicity call it 10%. You take 10%, v'zeu anikra maiser rishon, it's called the first tithe, v'noisne la'levi, and you give it to the Levite, to the Levi. It is referring to this gift when the Torah says in Parshas Korach, after the Korach rebellion, Torah gives a whole list of special gifts that are to be given to the Kohanim, and then right after that passage it goes into the gifts that are to be given to the rest of the tribe of Levi, to the Levites. It says in the Torah, Ki es ma'asar b'nei Yisrael, I put this verse second, the tithe from the Jewish people that they should lift up from their produce, nasati la'levim, that's the key words here. I gave to the Leviim. The Nemar, it also says in the earlier verse, V'livnei Levi, hine nasati es kol ma'aser b'Yisrael. To the sons of Levi I have given all tithes that the Jews will separate. Both of these verses are referring to this Maiser Rishon. After you give 2% to the Levi, the Jew has to give 10%. After you give 2% to the Kohen, the Jew has to give 10% to the Levi. Halacha Gimel, the Achar Kach, and after giving 10% to the Levi, returning to the gift of produce chart, Mafrish min Ashar Echad me'asara. You take another tenth. And so, again, it's roughly about 9%, if you're talking in percentage-wise, because you've already taken 2, you've already taken 10%. So, from what remains, you're taking about 9%, but it's a tenth of the total. V'hu anikra meiser sheni. This is called the second tithe. V'hu lebalav. The second tithe doesn't go to anybody special, it goes to you, it goes to the owner. And the owner eats it in Jerusalem. V'alav nemar, about this gift, the Torah states, or it's referring to this gift when Torah says, V'im ga'ol yig'al ish mima asroi. If a person were to redeem from his tithe refers to the tithe that belongs to the owner. That pasuk is talking about a special law that if you want to convert actual Meiser Sheni produce into money, you need to add a fifth to it, as we're going to learn in great length when we get to the laws about the second tithe. The point is that Rambam is trying to show you the verses in the Torah that are referring to the specific gifts. This verse, talking about redeeming Meiser, is referring to Meiser Sheni, the second tithe. It's also referring to, in the Torah, the Alav Ne'amar, about it, the second tithe that says, Aser to Aser, you shall take a tithe, and you should eat it before God in the place where He chooses, in the Holy Temple. In other words, which Meiser is Torah referring to when it says, take the tithe and you eat it? That's the Meiser that goes to the owner, the Meiser Sheni, the second tithe. So that's typically the way it works. Ala Seder Hazeh, following this order, mafrishin b'shana rishayna min hashavua, ubashniya, ubareviyis, ubachamishis. We separate the following gifts in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. The agricultural cycle was 7 years. 6 years you planted the land, 7th year you let it lie fallow, you weren't allowed to work the land, everything was ownerless. So, of the 7-year cycle, 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th were the years that had Meiser Sheni as the second tithe. It would go to the owner to be eaten in Jerusalem. Aval bashlishis ubashishis min hashavua, but in years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle, achar shemafrishim meiser rishon, after taking the first tithe, the regular tithe that goes to the Levi, instead of doing meiser sheni, a second tithe for yourself, mafrish min ashar meiser acher v'noisnei la'aniyim. You would take another tithe, and this time give it to the poor. V'hu anikra meiser ani, and that's the meiser we're talking about in this chapter, the tithe for the poor. Ve'ein b'shteshanim elu meiser sheni. During these 2 years, year 3 and 6 of Shemitah cycle, there is no Meiser Sheni where the owner takes the tenth for himself, brings to Jerusalem. Ella Meiser Ani. There's only the tithe for the poor. In other words, the farmer is always going to end up separating 2 tithes from his produce. In years 1, 2, 4, and 5, he's separating a tithe for the Levi and a tithe for himself in Jerusalem. In years 3 and 6, he's separating a tithe for the Levi and then a tithe for the poor. The Olav Nemar, it is referring to this special tithe to the poor that Torah is referring to when it says, Miktsei Shalosh Shanim, where's the verse here? At the end of 3 years, Toitzias Kol Ma'asar Tevuascha B'Shana Hahi, you should take all the tithes of your grain that year, V'hinachta B'Sharecha, put it in your gates, not to be taken to Jerusalem, eaten by you, but rather, Uba HaLevi, and let the Levite come, or poor people as the Torah describes it, who don't have enough money, and they'll take that tithe. The Alav Nemar, it's also about that tithe which the Torah says, Ki Sechale La'aser. When you conclude giving all your tithes, the Torah there is referring to the words Bashana Hashlishis. It's the 3rd year, Shnas HaMa'aser, the year of the individual tithe. You only end up giving one of the regular 2 tithes. You only give Meiser Rishon. The second of the 2 tithes is converted into Meiser Ani. So that's this verse, or these 2 verses are referring to Meiser Ani. Halacha Hey, once we're talking about the regular order of giving tithes, Shnas Hashmita Kula Hefker, the Rambam says the 7th sabbatical year is completely ownerless. Ve'ein baloi truma v'lei meiser is klal. We don't give any separations, any tithes, lei rishon v'lei sheni v'lei meiser ani, not the first one, not the second one, not the poor one. We don't own our fruits. So we don't have to give any tithes from the harvest. There is no harvest. It's all ownerless. So the land's not being worked. Outside of Israel, where there is no law to let the land lie fallow, mafrishin be'eretz Mitzrayim uve'amin uve'moyav. So in some of the nearby lands to Israel, in Egypt and Ammon and in Moyav, they do separate Meiser Rishon u'Meiser Ani. they would separate, like years 3 and 6, they would separate one tithe for the Levi and one tithe for the poor. The reason we give to the poor this year is because those lands are right near Israel. And we want to have a way for the poor people to have what to rely on. During Shemitah, they're going to rely on the poor tithes. And it's a tradition received directly from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai, that they should make this separation of the tithe for the poor during the 7th year, sabbatical year, in those lands of Ammon and Moav. But in the land of Babylon, further away from Israel, they would have to separate in year 7, actually the second tithe, the regular one to be brought to Jerusalem, like any other year. But it's only in these lands in general that were near Israel that had these laws applied to them. Once you go further out into the diaspora, the whole law of Trumas and Meiser doesn't even apply at all. Halacha Vav, again, once we're talking about the order of tithes, the Rambam goes into all the details, even though it's not relevant directly to this gift of the poor. Meiser Rishain Shalakach HaLevi, the 10% over here, which the Levi takes, Mafrish Mimenu Echad Me'asara V'Nesne LaKohen. He needs to then take a tenth of that and give it to the Kohen. V'hu Nikra Trumas Meiser. That's called the Truma taken from the tithe. Just like regular Truma of a Jew is what's given to the Kohen. So the Levi from his Meiser has a portion that's called Truma, Trumas Meiser. The portion that he has to give to the Kohen from the Meiser which he receives. The Alav Nemar, that's the gift Torah is referring to when it says, Ve'el haLevim tedaber, you should speak to the Levites, the whole passage where it talks about they should take Ma'aser min ha'Ma'aser, a tenth from their tenth. Halacha Zayin, Baal HaSodeh she'avru alav Aniyim, v'hoya le'sham Meiser Ani. Now let's return and get into the laws of this tithe for the poor. You have a field owner, there are poor people passing by, and he has a tithe, some of that tithe that's reserved for the poor in his field. Now again, knowing this can only be taking, knowing what we learned before, this can only be taking place in years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle. The way it works is you don't just give the whole load to one poor person. As the poor people pass by your field, you give every poor person that passes enough to satisfy him, to satiate him. Shenemar, as the verse says, "V'achlu b'sharecha v'saveyu." Here. This verse here. "V'achlu b'sharecha v'saveyu," they should eat in your gates and they'll be full. In other words, the allocation of Meiser Ani goes, each individual poor person, from each individual produce, gets enough to satiate him. Kidei savei kama, how much is that? How much is enough to satiate? So the Rambam goes through a number of different produce and defines their amount. If the Meiser Ani which he's distributing is wheat, lo yifches mechatzi kav, no less than a half a kav. It's a dry measurement. If it's barley you're giving out, no less than a kav. That's the satiating amount. Same thing for spelt, no less than a kav. In the Rambam source in Maseches Peah, it's actually a kav and a half. And the commentators wonder why the Rambam changed to a kav. If it's dried figs, also no less than a kav. If it's a mass, a cake of dried figs, you should do no less than 25 silver coins weight. If it's wine you're giving out, no less than a half a leg. A leg is a liquid measurement. If it's oil, no less than a quarter of a leg, about 3 to 4 ounces. If it's rice you're giving out, Reiva hakav, a quarter of a kav. Nosan la yarak, if it's vegetables you're giving out. Nosan la mishkal litra, v'hu mishkal chamisha u'shleishim dinar. You give him the weight of a litra, which is 35 dinar, also a silver coin, the weight of that coin. Mina charuvin, if it's caribs you're giving out. Shleisha kabin, 3 kav is enough to satiate. Mino agazim asara, mino afarsikin chamisha. Walnuts 10, peaches 5, so you're giving an actual amount. Mino rimaynim shnayim esrek echad. 2 pomegranates, 1 esrog. They would grow esrogs as regular fruits. So you give 1 to the poor. If it's any other fruit or any other produce you're giving to the poor, the way you want to think about it is, whatever you're giving to the poor person, can he sell it and get enough money to buy 2 meals? If that's how much you're giving him, that's considered satiation. Satiation is meals for a day. Typically people would eat 2 meals a day. If you're giving him enough to be able to buy 2 meals worth, you've given him enough. What if you only have a little bit of Meiser Ani? And there are many poor people, not enough to give each person the right amount. Put whatever you have in front of them, let them divide it. When Meiser Ani is being divided in the granary, like the other gifts to the poor, the owner doesn't have the prerogative of deciding which poor person he wants to give it to. The poor people come, take it against his will. Even if the owner of the field himself was poor, we could take it out of his hand. In other words, if it's your harvest, you don't have the rights to decide who it goes to. But if the Meiser Ani is being given out in the home, not in the granary, the owner has the prerogative of who to give it to. He can give it to whichever poor person he wants. A person had Meiser in his granary, and he wanted to give it to a relative of his or a friend of his that was poor, but he can't. In the granary, anyone can come and take it. How does he get it home? He can take away half with the intention to give it to him, take it home and give it to him there. And the other half, let him reserve for first come, first serve. Whichever poor people come, you'll give them the proper amount, as we said. When do we say the law? That you only give the poor person enough to satiate him, in the field. But another difference between the field and the house. If you're giving out Meiser in the home, you can give it out to all poor people, even the tiniest amount, an olive-sized amount. The whole commandment to give enough for satiation is only said in the field. Because the poor person has nobody else to take from. So you're the one giving him charity, you have to give him enough to satiate him. But once you're home, there's 100 other homes he can knock on and get more money. As it says, in your gates, in other words, outside the city, in the field, that's where they have to eat and be full. But not once you're giving it at home. If both a man and a woman come to the home to collect Meiser Ani, we give the woman first, we let her go. Then we give to the father, to the man. Let's say you have a father and a son. You have a man and his relative. You have two brothers. You have two partners. And in either of these scenarios, one of them was poor, the father was poor, the son was poor, one brother was poor, one partner was poor. The other one can choose to give him, the poor person, his Meiser Ani. Father can do a son a favor, son can do a father the favor, partners can do each other favors, etc. Since they're right there, they can give each other the Meiser Ani. It's not considered cheating. If two poor people received a field as sharecroppers, which means each one's supposed to work the field and will get a percentage of what the field produces as payment. But they're both poor people. They make a little trick. Each one will separate Meiser Ani from his portion and give it to his friend. So they're both taking the tithes for the poor, but they're ending up switching it with each other. If a person receives the right to harvest the field, also, he takes on the job of harvesting in exchange for a percentage. He cannot take the fallen stocks, the forgotten stocks, the payah, the tithe for the poor that come from this field, because he has a portion in the harvest. When do we say this? If the contract was that he's taking a portion of the entire field, he's getting a third or a fourth for the pay. But if the owner of the field told him, the words he used were, a third of what you harvest or a quarter of what you harvest will be yours. He didn't give him a portion in the field. So that means he didn't get any money until he actually harvested. While he was harvesting, he was poor himself. Therefore, he can take the fallen stocks, forgotten stocks, the payah, which come as you harvest. And he cannot take the tithe for the poor, which comes after the harvest. You only separate the tithe for the poor after the harvest. At that point, he's already acquired the portion which he harvested, and he's now not befitting. He's not poor anymore. He has money. If a person sells his field, the land and the fruit, then he becomes poor. He can go back into his own field, what used to be his own field, and take the fallen stocks, forgotten stocks, the payah, the tithe for the poor from that field. But the buyer, even if the buyer is, so to speak, poor, he can no longer take the leket shicha and payah from that field. Even if he hasn't yet fully paid for it. Even if he borrowed money and bought it. He can no longer take the gifts to the poor from that field, not because we don't think he's poor, but because he owns the field. When you own the field, we said before, you don't get to take the Meiser Ani from that field. Yud Zayin Meiser Ani ein peirim mimenu milva. The tithe for the poor cannot be used to pay back a loan. Ve'ein mishalmi mimenu satagmulin. You cannot repay a mourner's gift. A mourner used to be gifted things by others, and then when the other people were in mourning, you would give them back a gift. You cannot do that with the Meiser Ani money. But you can repay another type of kindness, monetary kindness. As long as you notify the person that what he's getting is tithe for the poor. You cannot use the Meiser Ani to redeem captives. You cannot use it for shushvinus. Shushvinus is a similar concept to the mourner's gift, but it's a wedding gift. You would give somebody when he got married a gift, and when you got married, they would give you back a gift. So you can't use it for shushvinus. You cannot use it to fulfill a pledge for tzedakah. But what you could do is you can give it to the sage of a city for his benefit. You cannot take Meiser Ani out from Israel to the diaspora, because it says, in those verses we saw before, it says you have to leave it in your gates in Israel. Or it says they have to eat it in your gates and be full. That means that Meiser Ani has to be kept within the confines of the land of Israel.